welcome to the Rethinking Humanity podcast, where we dive deeper into what makes us human and what causes us to thrive. I'm Lacey Delane.
Hello, I'm Sonya Larrea.
And we are so glad to have you for episode 40. It is called False Choices, the Use of Man by Man, 19th Century Capitalism Part 2. We are also going to talk about U.S. women who are looking to have babies abroad. Why? We're going to tell you in just a few minutes. Sonya, what's going on? It's a beautiful day in Atlanta today. Have you been outside?
Yes, I have. I know that, you were talking about after this going to the pool. To me, It is beautiful, but it's really hot. It's still hot for me.
Yeah.
At least that's how I feel. I'm looking forward to it cooling down a bit, actually.
Yeah, fall is definitely right around the corner. But I felt a little bit of that break in the air today. I don't know if you did. Yeah. Breezy. Okay. You know, it's like feels like there's a little breeze, a little bit of a cool break in the air. So it's coming. It's coming soon. And I'm like squeezing the last bit of pool time out of this.
Of the summer.
Yes, exactly. As much as I can.
Yeah, because we're going to go in September here pretty soon.
Crazy, man. Crazy how time flies. I mean, sheesh. It'll be our 2nd year anniversary soon.
Wow.
Before we know it. Yeah.
So what is new with you?
Cool. I've got some really exciting stuff happening. I'm actually starting a new job this week, which I'm really, really excited about. These folks are in my neighborhood. I can walk to work every day, which is great. And I'm low-key considering, I'm definitely going to start doing some side work where I help people organize their homes, their kids' playrooms, their closets, their businesses in a way that's really functional and beautiful. And I've done it before. And I'm just now realizing like it's a perfect side business. So I'm kind of excited about that, Sonya. It's like
good.
New beginnings, man. It's really exciting.
That is cool. Here's cheers to Lacey.
Yay! We'll cheers each other with our water. What about you? Do you have anything exciting going on? Anything yourself?
No, nothing specific. I think in my case, I would say because there's so much happening in the world, which we know that's kind of like, if you watch news, we all know there's some just depressing things between COVID, Afghanistan. I think I'm trying to appreciate just that we have freedom or just a moment to, just simple things in life. If you can go get a cup of coffee or you can just lay in your bed for an hour, like it's just basic things that we take for granted that a lot of people don't have. So that's what I'm celebrating.
I love that. That's not a small thing to celebrate. I mean, I think I've found recently that when I've woken up, like I've done this recently, I've just like started to think like, I'm so grateful for this. I'm so thankful for this. I'm so thankful for this. And it really, man, it changes my whole day, like the whole trajectory of my day and kind of like my mood. And so I don't know. I think it's really helpful when we can find a space to find those things that are, and most of the time it's crazy. Like what you're saying, like I can sleep in the bed and I can rest. It's really simple, the things that we actually are thankful for. Yeah.
No, I agree. I just think it puts into perspective. I mean, I think our lives, in the modern world, we have so much going on, and there's stress and there's just you're doing this and doing that. But it's easy to forget that we do have things that we just, can walk outside and not be worried about getting bombed or something,
Yeah.
So those are freedoms that, we should really appreciate because we know not everybody in the world has that.
Well, this is something we did not mention in our last episode, and the whole thing in Afghanistan was starting. And I think part of maybe where you're getting this idea of like, hey, we can walk down the street and we don't have to worry about like a bombing happening. I've heard some really sad, just so heartbreaking stories about what's happening in Afghanistan right now. And of course, it feels horrible that really the U.S. started all this. Like we went in there, we made a mess, and we made it. It's even worse now, like that we've left, Yeah,
it's a long, long war, 20 years. I know you could go on either side to debate it. I was thinking about it today, like what I wanted to say about it. And I think what bothers me is that there aren't easy answers to these situations. They're very complex issues. But with all our intelligence and the money that is spent, well, it's always about money, is you think that we could do a better job as not only just the states, which the states is, in there, but as a world. Like, we could have better solutions, I know Fromm was very anti-war, but when you think of like women having to go back to live in a life where they're not educated, they have to cover themselves up. It's just like a regression to the past, which is so sad. And like you said, it's the humanitarian crisis. So I hope that, that as a world, we get our act together.
I hope we'll help a lot of refugees at this point. And I mean, I do find it ironic that we, went in there to, end the Taliban's regime, and look here we are, and they're in control again. Like,
exactly.
And some of the things that I've heard in the news recently has been that, like, from inside sources, they've said we had like zero real plans going in there of like what we really needed to do, wanted to do, what we were accomplishing. And so it really does make me think a lot about, why do we actually do war? And it goes back to the money thing and the greed thing. And I mean, war doesn't solve any problems. Like, we've mentioned this before on the podcast. It's silly. It's just death. It's destruction. It's what Fromm mentions whenever we can't fulfill the need to transcend. See previous episodes if you want to know more about this. We will either create, if we can't fulfill the need to transcend via creation, we will do it via destruction. And so this is exactly what we're seeing in Afghanistan and with our own army.
Yeah, I agree with you, Lacey. It's I was going to point out something else I think Fromm might mention is we always try to import democracy, and I know those are our ideals and values, but we don't think about how our culture and our world is, we can just import it into these other worlds.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that easy, obviously. And it may not be the answer everywhere.
Yes, I think that is a huge, thing that we can all think about. Just because a way works for us well does not mean a way that we do that way is going to work well for fill in the blank country. And I think there's a question to consider: whose responsibility is it to go in there and build, the structure of a society? I think it's a way, it's going to be much more sustainable if it's something that they are taking ownership of.
Sure.
And if it's something that we're coming in, if we want to be a part of it, we come in and we support them on whatever. But if we do it for them, this is exactly what happens. We leave and it
falls apart.
Destructs, So super sad.
So my thoughts are with people over there that.
Yes. I think there's some ways locally. I've been doing some research to help families who are refugees coming here. So that's something I've thought about doing. Another thing is we did an episode where we talked about some soldiers who had been in Afghanistan.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. And I'm trying to remember which episode that was. It was not.
I don't recall which one, but it highlighted two soldiers, like when they went, the first time they went, and the time they went, and then when they return, 20 years later or something. It was a time later, a number of years later. Maybe it was 10 years. But we looked at their life, how it changed.
I want to say we recorded that in June sometime. So if folks want to check that out, it's like a intro discussion, not a primary like title of the episode. So you have to search a little bit, but check that out because it's super enlightening. And those soldiers really felt like, I think they expressed that they felt discouraged, that, it was like, what was this all for? And
Absolutely.
I've heard that mental health is an issue for a lot of these soldiers right now who were a part of this war for the last 20 years. And then now it's like, what did we do? What was the point?
Yeah. PTSD. Yeah. I was trying to look it up, but if you go onto our account and check us out, Spotify or any of the ones that you listen to your podcast, you'll find it.
Yep. And you can also go to rethinkinghumanity.us.
Right.
click through the episodes for June, and you'll find it there. Let's see if you guys, if you enjoy listening to that alongside all the news around this right now. That'd be great to hear. Well, we want to talk also a little bit about an article before we get into our main content today that we read. Actually, I found it in the Guardian. I can't remember why I Googled this, but I did.
Okay.
I Googled something and I found this article and I was like, oh my God. And so it's called The Reverse Birth Tourist. Thank you, Victor, our awesome technical producer, popping it up on the screen.
Yay.
The Reverse Birth Tourist, U.S. women seek cheaper countries to have babies. Guys, women are going out of the country. We're looking to leave the U.S. to have babies. Why? Because it's so expensive. Sonya, have I mentioned this to you about myself personally ever before? Do you recall?
Yes, many times. We're not interested in having a child, and definitely not interested in having a child here.
I've said to people, I'm like, I don't want to have kids. However, the only way I would change my mind is if I was living in another country where the cost of living was lower, where the social safety net was better, all of those things. And then I stumble upon this article, and one of these, actually, I'm going to open it up. Actually, Victor, will you scroll back down to the bottom with the lady, the last picture of the lady kind of standing up in the mountains or whatever? Yeah. Right there. She says, I don't understand how people function in America. Oh, no.
I know. That's a great line, huh?
Yes. So I want to give some facts from this article, and then there's a little section I want to read. And then, of course, Sonya, obviously want to hear your thoughts too.
Okay.
The average costs of the average out-of-pocket cost for people with insurance in the U.S. to have a baby is $4,500 and $4,569. That's with insurance. That's the average out-of-pocket cost, which means you're probably looking at between $5,000 and $10,000. Like, it's crazy. The U.S. is the only high-income country that doesn't mandate paid maternity leave, has less paid time off, longer work weeks than most other developed countries. And infant care is over $15,000 a year in some parts of the country. Wow. Craziness. This is the best country on the planet, isn't it?
No. Yeah.
And I listen, I don't mean anything negative towards the U.S. in a way of like, I hate the U.S. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we have to destroy this idea that we are the best country on the planet and realize that there are better ways to do some things. Because if we think we are the best country on the planet, we won't even think about that we might be able to do things differently or better.
True.
Yes.
So I'll put my 2 cents in, and you can read this part, Lacey.
Okay.
Lacey and I spoke about this last night. So the big issue for me, I think this kind of bleeds into our idea of universal health care. In our country, you can't get sick, you can't have a problem, because no matter what your wealth is, unless you're just incredibly wealthy, most of us have to struggle to say, wow, can I even afford to go to the doctor, let alone have a child? And I think it says a lot about society, how we are not pro-family, that we don't support women and families who are bringing life into the world that will be people that will grow up to be human beings, adults that are going to be having jobs taking care of us. So,
right.
Whether it doesn't matter. They could become a doctor, a mechanic, they could be an artist. These are all individuals that are part of our society. So it doesn't say much to me that we don't value the family enough to support women and men for maternity leave, paternity leave, costs of childcare, costs of pregnancy and birth. It's just a no-brainer. So this article to me is just like, well, depressing that it's not, that we don't have those same, I guess, benefits. Yeah. That's what I will say.
Well, and when we start to read some of these, like the accounts, because it gives those facts, and then it has, like, I guess you could say the word testimonials, but just stories of people who live in other countries and have babies and what their costs are. And then you start to go, holy shit, like this is for real. This is like no joke, a real bad thing. And one of the folks was like, look, in our country, I think it's New Zealand, it's like we look at it as it's an investment in our society. And I love this point with our podcast because we talk a lot about society, right? And mental health and, the sane society and do we have a sane society and all those things. And to me, it makes perfect sense that when you invest in the people in your society, you're going to have a healthier, better society. And when you don't, you're not,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm on board with that idea.
Yeah. Let me read this first part. It's Sarah Samaranos, 31, marketing professional. She's in France. I was expecting to pay thousands of euros. She says, on giving birth abroad. In the US, I was living paycheck to paycheck. I was tired and I felt cheated. I had put in all this hard work. I finished my education like I was told to, put the hours in. I'm getting all this praise from my supervisors. So why is nothing moving? So I applied for a master's program in marketing in France. That's where I met my husband, a Frenchman from Normandy. When it came time to deliver my twins, we ended up having to go to the emergency room because something just felt off. I still had this really American fear of costs and was mentally doing the tally. Listen to this, because I totally resonated with this. Even as I'm in labor, not the labor part, but the tally. The entire time I'm thinking, okay, they've given me this medicine. Add that to the bill. I had an emergency C-section. Add that to the bill. I needed a bag of blood. Add it to the bill. I also had a private room with 3 square meals, a lactation consultant to teach me how to breastfeed, and someone who came in to teach us how to do the first bath. And in my head, all of that was going on to the tally. When the nurses started giving diapers and formula because my milk hadn't come in, I told my husband, no, go around the corner and buy diapers and formula. I'm not paying for this. But I totally get it because it's like.
Go buy the aspirin at the CVS, yeah.
Yeah, in the hospital. So this is the last paragraph. When it was time to leave the hospital, I told my husband, you go into the office and look at the bill. In my head, I was expecting to pay thousands of euros and was bracing for impact. And then he walked in, and 30 seconds later, he walked out, and I asked him, okay, how much was it? He said, darling, this is France. Get in the taxi. Total cost of childbirth, $0. Zero.
I know, that was good. I forgot about that. Yeah.
Isn't that great? And by the way, she received 100% of her current pay for maternity leave except ×2 because she had twins. How about them apples? I think, Sonya, can you tell me how that's hurtful to our society for her to get money to raise her kids?
No, it's healthy.
I wonder what she did. What do you think she did? You think she just
probably went out and bought some more diapers?
She probably spent it. I mean, geez, what a sin in a capitalistic society to spend money. It's a terrible idea to take care of people when they have a baby. Terrible.
I know. Oh my goodness, that's a great article.
Hope you can hear the sarcasm in my voice, guys.
Oh yeah.
All right. I get a little
good
bit.
Article. No, it's good. It's the message is well received. Trust me.
Can you relate to that when you had kids?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I will tell you one other real quick point to that whole article is think about people stuck in bad jobs. They can't leave the job because they say, oh, if I leave this job, I'm not going to have any insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another thing that you're beholden to the job. There's so many parts of that. You could go in many directions, Somebody who's a stay-at-home parent says, oh my God, I don't even have a job. So there's just multiple things. People who even want to contribute have to find the childcare. I mean, this is a conversation that you could go on for hours. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So you know what I'm talking about because you being a nanny, you being a teacher, you can relate to all this.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Well, let's get into our content for the day. This is episode 40. It's called False Choices, and it is the use of man by man. We're finishing up the conversation around what capitalism was like in the 19th century. Fromm suggests that it's very important for us to take a look at what the socioeconomic structure of our society is to know whether it's a sane society, because our number one drive as human beings is to survive. And in order for us to survive in a capitalistic society, we have to produce and consume, i.e. we have to make money. So whatever the system is around making money or producing and consuming is going to determine how we live our lives. And so that's why we're kind of going through what capitalism looks like. We've talked about 17th and 18th century capitalism. Now we've talked a little bit about 19th century, and we're going to finish up 19th century capitalism today. So he starts out talking about feudal society, which of course is 19th century. In feudal society, of course, that was capitalistic. They were obligated to provide at least a minimum standard of living. There was a standard amount of human solidarity as well. It was like a system of mutual human obligation, and it was governed by certain human conditions. I'm sorry, that's feudal. That's not 19th century. That's before 19th century.
Right.
My apologies. So basically that there's an understanding in the feudal society that we're talking about human beings. We're talking about more than just an exchange. We're talking about a quality of life that's a part of, people agreeing to work on each other's behalfs, basically.
Right. And then that starts to shift when we're going into the 19th century.
Yes.
Because Fromm does bring up the fact there's exploitation. And there's exploitation in all these systems, but when you're starting to go into the 19th century, the worker, or rather his labor, becomes a commodity.
Yes.
To be bought by the owner of capital, which is different from what we were talking to before about the feudal society, where there's a lord and he is, has the right to demand services. But at the same time, there's customs and obligations that you're going to be the subjects of the lord are going to at least get the minimum to survive.
Yes. Right. And they're going to be treated as humans, and they're going to be not looked at as objects to be used in a way that's degrading for them. And who cares how they're doing? That's not my responsibility. But, I do care about how you're doing. That is part of my responsibility. And it's a part of our responsibility as a whole and as a community and as a society to take care of each other. That broke down in the 19th century. And that breakdown of human solidarity is really what led to the exploitation. And what you're saying, which is something you've said since I've known you, Sonya, since I met you, is this transactional relationships is a phrase that you've used. And that's kind of the direction things went in the 19th century.
Right. And the exploitation I thought was interesting because it says it was not personal anymore, but it had become anonymous. And that's pretty powerful. So because we're talking about the law of the market, and I told you previously that when I think of anonymous, you don't think of a specific person, but it's just the system that you're in.
Yeah.
For me, that's how I would define that,
Yeah, and that's how it worked. I mean, exploitation became the integral part of the societal structure, and there was nobody responsible for that. And folks just accepted it as the iron law of society. And if you think about it now, that's similar. We don't think about, wait a minute, people are being exploited. Who's responsible? We're all responsible. Let's do something. It's oh no, that's just how things are.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Fromm is trying to show sort of this transition. And I think it's interesting because even though you're going through all the centuries, you're still going to see the problems. It's not necessarily, which it's interesting when we get further into this, that we think it's going to get better, but it doesn't necessarily get better. And one of the things that he says that in the 19th century happens is that, both 20th and 19th, but 19th century, it's based on the principle that's to be found in all class societies, which is the use of man by man, which you have as the title of this.
Right.
Of our episode today, which I think is very important that we point that out. Yeah, go ahead, Lacey.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say, the other thing, you mentioned this, that workers were used as a commodity to be bought by the owner of capital, and not essentially different from any other commodity on the market. And it was to be used to its fullest capacity by the buyer. So that's where the exploitation kind of comes in. And that really reminds me a lot of our first season and what we talked about. Man is not a thing, like having and being, and us turning humans. When we say man, we're talking about humans, turning humans into things, instead of, stripping us of our humanity, basically.
Right. And I think it's the line here that I want to read is that he says, the fact remains the same that a man, a living human being, ceases to be an end in himself and becomes the means for the economic interests of another man or himself or of an impersonal giant, the economic machine.
So good. I think that if you were to ask me after now having read Fromm for a while, if you were to ask me, Lacey, how do you really describe freedom? I would say it's when man lives in a way that he's a means to his own end. So he's not living in this way. He's not living in a way that he is the means for the economic interests of another man. Because then your life is controlled by someone else.
Correct. And it's interesting because Fromm does point out that there's objections to this statement, right? That, one could say that you're a voluntary participant, like you could accept or decline a contract.
Yeah.
But he says this ignores the fact that in the first place, man has no choice but to accept the existing conditions. And secondly, that even if you were not forced to accept these conditions, he would still be employed, that is, made use of for purposes not his own, but of the capital of whose profit he serves.
Yeah. Why? Because of the societal structure. And that's where we get the first part of the title, which is false choices. It's a false choice. Oh, well, no, it's not. People will say, oh, but no, it's a choice. You can choose not to work or you can choose to work. No, fuck that. That's not true. You can't choose not to work.
No, you can't.
You want to eat and live. That's just not how it works. Now, for people who come from a very, well-to-do family or background or what have you, maybe that is a reality, but that is a small percentage of the population. It's not the majority of the population.
Right. And then the second objection he talks about is that there's a certain amount of social cooperation that a person has to fulfill. And he says, well, that's true. We are ignoring the fact that in a society where no person has power over another, each person fulfills his functions on the basis of cooperation and mutuality. No one can command another person except insofar as a relationship. And so he gives a lot of examples how our society is today. He points out that in certain relationships, no one would dare to think of commanding the other person. So I look at that as, when you're looking at a work environment, that's very different than an arrangement of a relationship, for example.
Yeah. I mean, what it boils down to is it's people doing these things because they really want to, from a place of interior motivation, not exterior obligation. And so that makes a huge difference in one's quality of life, because it's like when we had Melissa Bernstein on, she says most of the anxiety that we see is because we are disconnected from our authentic selves. Our authentic selves aren't allowed to, we're not allowed to really be our authentic selves as much whenever we have these exterior obligations that are driving us in our decisions. But whenever we have a society that functions based on cooperation and mutuality, where we do things because we choose to, where we have the autonomy to do them, now that's different.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hear you.
He says that a little later on too. He says the only reason for expecting his help in that type of situation lies in the mutual feeling of love, friendship, or just simply human solidarity.
Yes. The other line that is so good when he's discussing the use of man by man is how capital employs labor, the living vitality and power of the present. And in capitalistic hierarchy of values, I thought that was so good. The capital stands higher than labor.
Yeah.
That the person who owns capital commands the person who only owns his life. Mm-hmm. Only owns his life.
Yeah. So basically the dead, the thing is higher than the living, the human. So it's like the human being who owns himself is not as powerful as capital, a thing, which tells me that we've basically gotten ourselves into the situation where we actually don't have autonomy over our lives anymore. We've created these things, and now these things that we've created basically rule and control and direct and lead our lives.
You're right. It goes back to what you said, that if you had to describe what freedom was, I think that's really good. Where a living human being ceases to be an end in himself and becomes, that's the best line to kind of sum it from, and becomes the means for the economic interests of another man.
Yeah.
It's the theme of, like you're saying, of things, their amassment in the world of life and its productivity.
Right.
It's the conflict between those is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Between the two principles of values. Yes.
Yeah. That's the little section I was going to read, that little sentence there, that the conflict between capital and labor is much more than the conflict between two classes. It's actually the conflict between two principles of value, which, if we stop for a second, we think about, okay, what does that actually mean? What does that mean? That actually means that our society is set up on specific values. And here's the two competing values between the world of things and their amassment. So just getting stuff, just bunches of stuff. And production and consumption is another way to say that. Or the world of life and its productivity. So like living, being, experiencing, and actually producing, not in the capitalistic 21st century capitalistic sense of the word, but in the my mind, my heart, my body, my life, my livelihood, myself is connected and alive as a being.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right there. We're really far from that, but that's kind of the theme of all of the things that we've loved starting to have or to be, right?
Yeah.
The other part of this that gets really interesting is authority.
Yes.
He speaks about the rational and irrational authority.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's cool. Go ahead.
Do you want to give the example of what between rational and irrational?
I can, or if you want to. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry.
No. I mean, the one that stood really strong for me was rational authority. He gives an example of a teacher and a student, where the teacher would have rational authority over the student. And as time goes, the student would be learning more, so would get closer to what the teacher's knowledge is. Whereas if you have a slave and a master, that's the irrational authority. There's always going to be that, distinction between the slave and the master.
Right. And the idea of rational authority is that at some point you're not going to need that anymore. Like it's going to disappear.
It's going to dissolve.
It's going to dissolve. Right. Let me see if there's something here. I have a couple things underlined that I really wanted to share on that. Any social system in which one group of the population is commanded by another, especially if the latter is a minority, must be based on a strong sense of authority, a sense which is increased in a strongly patriarchal society where the male sex is supposed to be superior to and in control of the female sex. We haven't talked about the patriarchy at all, have we, Sonya?
No.
Authority refers to an interpersonal relation in which one person looks upon another as somebody superior to him, but there's a fundamental difference between a kind of superiority-inferiority relation, which can be called rational authority, and one which may be described as inhibiting or irrational authority. So the inhibiting is the irrational, and then the rational is the one that's not. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so to your point that you were saying earlier, like in a rational kind of authority, the strength of emotional ties will tend to decrease in direct proportion to the degree in which the person subjected to the authority becomes stronger and thereby more similar to the authority, which is how I was explaining between the teacher and the student, because you could say as the time goes by, there's a graduation of their knowledge. Like they get closer, as opposed to other relationships where there's always going to be the distinction of, between, as I said, like a slave and a master.
That's cool. And you know what that reminds me of? Motherhood, and the goal of motherhood as to let the child go. And that episode that we did on the challenges of American motherhood.
Yes.
But yes, I think that would be a great example of like, a rational authority. The parent, like the goal over time is to let go and them not to need the parent anymore,
Correct.
At least not in the same ways. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, he gives the example, like the slave owner, on the other hand, wants to exploit the slave as much as possible. The more he gets out of him, the more he is satisfied. And so there you have that superiority that you were talking about before with the relationship, where authority has that level of superiority over the slave. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. No, and I was going to say it's also there's a antagonism in irrational authority, which I thought that's very interesting. And in a rational authority, there's not that sense of antagonism included.
Right, and there's resentment and hostility that comes with the irrational authority.
Yes.
Where the other type of authority, you can have admiration, gratitude, love. They're very different.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense too, because if you're actually empowering me to learn and grow, and I'm doing it, and you're not holding me back, man, of course I'm going to feel super gratitude, super, much of admiration and a human connection,
Yeah, and he goes on to say that in the 19th century, we have a mix actually between rational and irrational authority.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually gives an example that the character of society was a hierarchical one. It wasn't like the feudal society, but was more on the ownership of capital. Those who owned it could buy and thus command the labor of those who did not. And the latter had to obey under penalty of starvation. So there was a blending between the new and the old.
Yeah.
But he does talk about that obedience is still one of the fundamental virtues, and disobedience one of the elementary vices during that time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you say, under penalty of starvation. I mean, I think that remains in 21st century capitalism where we are today.
Oh, yeah.
There wasn't that in the feudal system in 17th and 18th century capitalism. We didn't see that, like there was a common decency, a human solidarity, a care for others in a way that wasn't a thing. A penalty of starvation was not a thing, because we're all human beings here.
Right. And, I didn't realize he talks about obviously then you have the Reformation and Renaissance where man is starting to rely on his own reason. And he does talk about, the difference between right and wrong, how it was very important to men. They had sort of a pride of, how they looked at themselves. And he also brings up the point historically that I didn't realize, that we even succeeded to be the most peaceful time between 1814 and 1914. That was one of the most peaceful periods history has ever known.
Right.
Which that's 100 years of, of peacefulness, which is quite an accomplishment.
That is quite an accomplishment. However, he does go on to begin to mention what happens in 20th century capitalism. And he says that if you kind of take a look at it based on the changes that were made, you would think we would have achieved a saner society. However, we don't see that. The world in the middle of the 20th century is mentally sicker than it was in the 19th century. Indeed, we are not in danger of becoming slaves anymore, but of becoming robots. That's a interesting one.
Yeah. I mean, so what I find fascinating, okay, if you look at all this, he really talks about going through these centuries. If you're in the 19th century talking about reform, also in the beginning of the 20th century, and he does talk about how we kind of move forward in all these things that we're trying to master. Like we become less, we don't have this whole hierarchical structure. You know, people are supposedly, they have more rights, like with labor unions. And so you're thinking there's more prosperity. There is more sexual freedom. There's more political freedom. But Fromm says we're still mentally sicker than we were in the 19th century. And so that's what's really interesting, because there was this expectation, like he said, Marx could have never imagined how far we would come. But even though there's this progression, we don't get to where we need to be. And I thought that was quite remarkable, because there is a progression, but we don't achieve what we need to achieve to have man not be a thing, as you're saying.
Yeah. And do you know, just from your, and I feel like I did know this, but I don't recall, like kind of what he's insinuating here that we're missing.
Do I think that what he's insinuating that what we are missing?
Well, what we're missing from the 19th to the 20th, we thought it was going to all go right? And it was going to be, we were going to solve that. And then the 20th century were worse than the 19th century. So I'm wondering if you know what he's kind of pointing to that we're missing. And it's okay if you don't, but I'm just trying to.
I have my thoughts, but let's hear what you're saying, Lacey.
I don't recall. That's why I'm asking you.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I would say, because I'd say what he's saying we're missing is what we started on the To Have or To Be, is that we're missing the fact, like just in the very beginning. Well, actually, the title of this is that we're looking at man as a thing, as opposed to a being, which we could bring in love. We could bring, there's so many aspects of that, but we've lost sight of the fact that, that man in and of itself is a goal, what we were saying earlier, because we've seen the transformation of all the uses of man, as opposed to being in existence, just man in and of itself. That's the end goal, and as we know, we've talked about that unless you're producing, unless you're part of this machine. So, I mean, I think you can really boil down. I mean, productivity, he actually talks about productivity, but productivity from a different perspective than what we're trying to say. The productivity of just being a human being, not the productivity of I've got to make these 10,000 pens.
Right.
Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of productivity in its truest, most genuine form is that of a personal growth and transformation, a presence in the moment, a connection with other people, a being. And that is precisely what's gotten lost in the 19th, century capitalism, 21st century capitalism. And then, of course, the idea of productivity, the even definition of it has been changed as a result of our socioeconomic structure. So I'm a purist in the form of the word productivity actually doesn't mean you made a lot of money this month,
right?
Or you did a lot of shit this month, or you worked a lot of hours. It actually means I'm feeling alive. I'm in touch with myself. I can feel what's happening in my body. I'm connected. I'm present in my body. I'm in touch with my emotions. I can tell you what my emotions are. Whenever I get upset about something, I can understand what it is and not take it out on other people. And that can provide for a way different quality of life when it comes to relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to learn as we move through this, for everybody's the sane society, as we move through his writings. But he says we have to recognize the specific pathological problems of our time in order to arrive at a vision of that which is necessary to save the Western world from an increasing insanity. And so he goes on to say that he's going to go on to diagnose this and to tell us. I think we're going to learn more what his specific ideas are. Those were just my thoughts of what we know so far in our reading of Fromm.
I love it. Yeah. And I appreciate you mentioning, I thought about that anybody knew who might be listening. We're taking from Erich Fromm's The Sane Society, one of several books that he wrote when he was alive between 1900 and 1980. So lots of foresight that he had about what life was doing and what life was like at the time. So that's where we're taking this from. And it's going to be interesting to see kind of his diagnosis, which is going to be, I'm sure we'll partially talk about it in the next episode. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for being with us. Hope you have a great rest of your weekend. We look forward to seeing you next time on the Rethinking Humanity podcast.
Bye, guys.
Bye.